Hey guys, Savage Joy here with Real Progressives. Tonight I am joined by a gentleman who I've followed for quite some time, and he actually recently announced he's going to be running for Senate. So tonight we have Mr. Qasim Rashid, and he is running for Senate in Virginia, District 28. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thanks for having me, Joyce. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I was looking through your website and all of your your platform. First, I always go to the about me part first because I kind of want to see where you came from, why you're passionate about these things. So it does state on your page that you are an immigrant and a Muslim. So can you kind of touch on that and how that's influenced your life?
Well, sure. I mean, that's a big part of my identity and is a big part of where I think um, I've had the opportunity to bring my experience to this campaign. Being an immigrant, coming from a country like Pakistan, where I was born, and migrating to the United States, two very different countries. But what a lot of people don't know is that Pakistan and the U.S. were very similar in their founding. They both escaped, British colonial rule. They both sought to have sovereignty and independence based on religious freedom and racial justice and gender equality. And they both didn't get off to the greatest start. Pakistan, unfortunately, has deteriorated pretty aggressively from its founding ideals, and it was in that midst in the 1980s that my family and I migrated to the United States. And many consider it cliche to talk about the American dream, but that's really one thing that we were pursuing. And coming to a new country where you're the minority in many respects, it's a new culture, new language, new system of everything. There's a struggle. My parents are teachers, and they're not ones to let you kind of sit idle or feel sorry for yourself. And literally, kicked us in the butt to get out and make something of ourselves. And again, that struggle continued. I mean, I remember, despite our best efforts, living in Section 8 housing, needing to rely on food stamps, SNAP and TANF to make sure we had ends meet. I've been working since I was 15 years old at the local grocery store. And walking home 2 miles at 11 o'clock at night because we needed to make ends meet, and there was no one there to pick me up. And so when I talk about these things and my faith as a Muslim, it really boils down to this fundamental concept that a Muslim's primary responsibility is to serve humanity. Everything else is secondary to that. And so the way we were indoctrinated, if you want to call it that, about religion is that your job is to serve humanity. That's it. You should be so focused on serving humanity that you don't have time to judge people. You don't have time to look down upon people. Your job is simply, if someone is in need, it's your obligation to serve. And that's kind of my approach to religion in general. That whatever your faith is or isn't, good for you, but let me see how you serve humanity. Let me see how you serve marginalized communities. And that's what informed me throughout my life. That's what inspired me to get into human rights law, and my wife with her urging and pushing. And so when I talk about the policy that I want to make, it's based on the advocacy I've already done and the experience I've already had. It allows me to understand the struggle of lower income people, of middle class people, of immigrants, of people of color from a firsthand basis. And now that I've been given privilege of education and a household and a stable family, all these things that a lot of people take for granted, I recognize them as privileges. I want to use the skills that I've been fortunate and blessed to attain to pay it forward. The same way people lifted me and my family up, and the same way this country's given me some amazing opportunities, I want to take that and pass the baton to uplift the next generation, uplift those who maybe don't have the same privileges that I have right now.
Absolutely, right on. I usually follow up with this question. So just because we do have a lot of people who are humanists or atheists or whatever who watch. Now, as far as these questions and everything, it's cool. I've seen a lot of your speeches. They're always beautiful. But for those who are concerned about separation of church and state, do you have a policy when it comes down to, actually being on the floor, the Senate floor, or producing legislation, things like this, the actual business part of it per se?
Well, if I understand your question, let me step back. And, as I said, it bears repeating that when I look at how I can serve, to emphasize that whether somebody has a faith or no faith is actually secondary to me. What I want to know is, what are they doing to actually serve humanity? And so when I talk about a government, we're a secular government. We're not a theocracy. And my responsibility is to ensure fairness and justice for every person, regardless of what religion they follow or don't follow. That's how, ironically, that's what Islam teaches as well, that there should be separation of religion and state. And for those interested, I can cite the examples from early Islamic history where the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, mandated separation of religion and state. And the reason for that is because what someone's definition of morality is it varies. Morality to you might be different than it is to me. But justice is a secular standard that reigns supreme, right? And when we have a government that's based on justice, that is more concerned about ensuring every person has fairness and a fair shot, rather than dictating their conscience and their inner morality, that's how we move forward. I want to build a government. I want to build a country where people aren't one faith or another faith, but people have the right to decide what they believe and how they believe as far as their internal thought processes go. I think protecting freedom of conscience, and I've written about this extensively, is for me, the foundational core of how you build a successful society. People must have universal freedom of conscience, and there's no asterisk next to universal. There are some extremists that will preach that, I believe in universal freedom of conscience. As long as you're in this particular religion, you can believe whatever you want. And I'm like, I don't think you understand what that word actually means. It does not mean what you think it means. So for me, when we talk about the Senate floor, my goal is to ensure that we're not leaving out any groups. We're passing policy that is inclusive, that is representative of a secular republic, of a democracy. And that's how we move forward, and ensuring that whether somebody's an atheist or a humanist or a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian or Sikh or Hindu or what have you, they have the right to practice their belief or non-belief without any kind of discrimination or oppression.
Absolutely. So given that, we have this person in office as the president, how is that, being a Muslim, an immigrant, and then seeing, people like Ilan and, just being completely unfairly, unjustly attacked? It's infuriating for all of us, but how is that, for you?
Well, I don't even need to go all the way to the White House. My Senate opponent has already been launching some pretty vicious anti-Muslim attack ads on me for basically the entire campaign. And I see this as a sign of progress, ironically, because when people don't have arguments against your positions based on merit, they attack your identity. They attack things that are oftentimes immutable characteristics. And 45 dresses up his criticisms as national security or this, that, and the other, but it's just a sham covering for his racist ideologies. I mean, even just now, he's turning away hurricane refugees from the Bahamas with some excuse about national security when it hasn't been an issue for the last how many decades, but now suddenly when they're hurricane refugees, it suddenly becomes an issue. So, I don't let this stuff deter me. I'm getting death threats from white supremacists. I actually have a court date on October 7th in North Carolina because a white supremacist threatened to kill me, and I have to go testify against him in court. If I were to let each one of these folks get me down, I would have quit a long time ago. I look for the positive in humanity. I was speaking at an event earlier today at the NAACP, and I was asked a question about the white supremacist monuments and what I would do about them, and how I would work with people who support them. And I said, look, ultimately, I still believe that every person has some goodness in them, and sometimes it's very difficult to find. But for me, engagement doesn't mean endorsement. I need to keep the door open because you never know who might slip through and have a change of heart. And then I also look at the fact, and this is the last point I'll make about this, that the level of love and compassion that I've gotten from people is really overwhelming. And from all stripes and backgrounds. I mean, it's really remarkable. Sure, I get the nasty tweets and the threats and whatnot, but it pales in comparison to just the amazing letters and emails and DMs that I get from people who say, hey, I'm rooting for you, I support you, and you always got a place in my home. And I think that represents the majority of people. I want to be remembered as a guy who always let them feel like they could knock on my door and we could have that conversation. I don't want to be the guy who shunned people away.
Yeah, I saw your post earlier today that stated, I believe you're at a grocery store and someone recognized you and said they were going to vote for you. And I was like, it just gave me goosebumps. I was like, this is what it's about right here. Just these organic moments.
Yeah.
So good.
It was pretty funny. I was getting milk. My wife texted me on the way home that make sure you pick up milk. So after a long day of canvassing, I'm at and this guy's just staring me down. And I'm like, hey, you okay? He goes, yeah. Are you famous? And it was such a weird question to get. But we had a good, healthy conversation. So, and that's what I mean. I mean, I think people are genuinely good, are innately good. And there's a lot more love than hate out there. Sometimes we forget that because we see so much of the hate in the media. So it's good to have those reminders. And I share these little stories because I think they're good nuggets that we should be telling that story of positivity.
Absolutely. So on your platform, you do show you state climate change and environment is the top thing situationally on your platform. What do you think is, I mean, it's such a broad topic, but what do you think are the most important elements that we need to address first?
Are you talking regarding climate change?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Sure. I think Elizabeth Warren actually summarized this pretty effectively the other day that, we keep getting into arguments about hamburgers and straws and different kinds of light bulbs. And those human behavioral changes need to happen, sure. But let's not lose sight of the fact that it's 3 industries and 100 companies that account for 70% of the carbon we throw into the atmosphere. And there are policy changes we can make to diminish that significantly. You can stop using plastic straws. I could stop using plastic straws, and it'll make virtually no dent whatsoever. It'll make no noticeable dent into the pollution out there, right? That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, but it just means that isn't the sufficient methodology to ensure that we curb the impacts of climate change. And that's where I see an intersectionality between a lot of this stuff. I mean, for example, how are we going to have these companies change their policies or pass legislation to require them to change their policies if we're also taking money from them for our campaigns, if we're dependent upon them for re-election? And that's where I've been adamant that we will not take money from these organizations. My Senate opponent is a gentleman who he actually chairs the Senate Environment Committee. And despite chairing the Senate Environment Committee, he takes money from the largest energy company, tens of thousands of dollars. He advocates for offshore drilling, which is mind-blowing to me. Despite having majorities in the House and the Senate and backing from a Democratic governor, He's been unable to ban fracking because he doesn't care to. So his reelection depends on abusing the climate. That's what it comes down to. And so I put that there because I see such a level of intersectionality between these things. And so when I talk about what are the first things we need to change, it's to change politicians who are funded by these corporations, because until we can get rid of those politicians funded by these corporations and vote them out, the corporations are the ones ruling our society, not the government, and not the people that are duly elected. Once we do that, then we can start to enact better policy. Then we can start to invest in green energy and green jobs, and ensure that we have companies following protocols that are both economically viable and also green. And I think that's one of the biggest myths, that people think that if I go green, it's going to hurt the economy. But it's the exact opposite, right? The economy didn't get worse when we went from horses to cars. It got better. And when we talk about the next level of auto technology, next level of housing technology, next level of just production technology, yes, there is a transition cost that is necessary. That's obvious. But that doesn't mean that we ignore the immense benefits and the immense long-term gains just because the short-term cost is a little bit higher than what the status quo typically is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you support a federal job guarantee?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
Awesome.
so, and even on a more local level, when we talk about, the living wage, and the current poverty wage in Virginia is $7.25 an hour. You could be a couple, and you could both be working a full-time job at minimum wage, and you could even take up a couple extra shifts and work 50 hours a week each. And despite that, there's not a single county in Virginia where you can afford an apartment. Not a single one. It's just mind-boggling to me that we've allowed this to happen. You have companies like Walmart, which made $500 billion in revenue last year and $36 billion in profits. In just profits, $36 billion. And despite that, they pay their employees so little that Walmart employees collected $6.2 billion in welfare. And look, I'm the last guy to demonize people on welfare. I'm demonizing Walmart. That how on earth are you going to have $36 billion in profits and still not pay your workers enough, forcing them to go on welfare? We're not subsidizing Americans, we're subsidizing Walmart at this point. And if Walmart raised their the pay of their bottom million employees by $5 an hour, it would cost them an extra $10 billion a year. And what that would do is that it would mean that Walmart's profits, instead of being $36 billion, it would be a measly $26 billion. I'm sure they'll just scrape by with $26 billion. And more significantly, it'll do two more things. One, it'll put $10 billion more in the hands of the middle class. And what are they going to do with that $10 billion? They're going to spend it, which will further strengthen the middle class. And finally, that $6.2 billion that we're currently spending on subsidizing Walmart, that can go into education, that can go into healthcare, that can go into driving down the price of insulin. I mean, there's so much that could happen if we just realize that the 4 members of the Walton family shouldn't have to force us to live off of welfare. In fact, the $6 billion saved could end homelessness in America. 500,000 conservative estimate of homeless in America. So 1.5 million people are living in poverty because 4 people demand that they earn $36 billion instead of $26 billion. So, it's this kind of wealth inequality that it keeps me up at night. It frustrates me to no end. And it also drives me to work harder and work smarter so we can pass better policy to stop these ongoing injustices.
Well, and I'm not sure if you saw this, but recently, I believe it was last month, Bernard Sanders came out with a bill specifically towards Walmart, which states that they will be fined the amount that the people, their employee, actually end up getting from welfare because
Yeah.
they are being paid enough. So
Yeah.
they're going to end up owing it anyway. And
Good.
his bill is, essentially the best way to call them out.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I think that's what needs to happen. That's ultimately. I mean, it's bad enough that they've already decimated small businesses, but now after decimating small businesses, they've decimated the middle class, and it's a vicious cycle, and it will not end well for our country because you are going to, right now, wealth inequality is worse in September of 2019 than it was in September of 1929, right before the Great Depression. And that's my fear, that this corporate worship will result in a devastation of our economy that will take decades to recover from. That's what we're trying to prevent.
Yeah, I agree. Something else you have. Oh, so kind of underneath climate change, you have that Virginia is ranked 41st in quality of life.
Yeah.
Do you want to touch on that?
Well, it goes back to climate change, and it goes back to workers' rights. I mean, we our oil, water, and soil is continuing to get poisoned by fracking, by demands to build pipelines, by offshore drilling, and it's unfortunately gotten worse every year. Our infrastructure is abysmal. Our workers are ranked. Workers' rights were ranked dead last. Oxfam ranked us dead last in the country. And it's not due to a lack of money. We're ranked number one for business. And so once you get over the quagmire of how you can separate workers from business, because I don't know how you can claim we're number one in business, but we're dead last for workers' rights. But then you begin to realize that when you have a situation where a basic living wage is denied, where basic health care is denied, where 1.2 million Virginians don't have paid sick leave. So if they get sick, they have to choose between a paycheck and getting healthy. Or if their kid gets sick, they have to choose between staying home with their kid or going to work to make sure their kid has lunch money tomorrow. It's just it's an abysmal situation in that respect. And those are some of the things that we're trying to focus on. And so when you look at 41st and quality of life, this is kind of what we're looking at. These are some of the concerns we're trying to address. And I think that if we work hard and flip the House and the Senate, we have a Democrat in the governor's mansion as it is, we can start to pass some significant legislation that would otherwise have been impossible. And that's what really, really excites me, because the sky's the limit. And I think, especially coming into the 2020 election, we can do something that no other state in the country can do. And that is send a clear message to the White House that your days are numbered. The country rejects 45's policies, his economic policies, his healthcare policies, and we actually embrace a progressive agenda that is inclusive, that empowers the middle class, and provides these basic human rights like healthcare, food, a jobs guarantee that should be basic fundamental human rights, but for some reason aren't yet. So that's really why this election is so critical right now, and that's how we move the needle up from being 41st to hopefully significantly better by next year.
And with all that, we'd also get the first Jewish president. Yay! I see these comments. So you also talk about criminal justice. Now, obviously, you have a history in law. So, and you stated you did do some criminal justice. Your platform showed that you were actually a clergyman.
Yeah, I was a prison chaplain for about 4 years in the Virginia State prison system.
And what was that like? I know you served as a mentor. What was it like just kind of hearing their story?
One day I started counting the number of doors I had to walk through to see the incarcerated citizens. And it was 17 doors I had to walk through to see these folks. And that doesn't even include the barbed wire fences and things like that. But 17 doors just to, we're caging these folks like animals. We're giving them no rehabilitation. no incentive to improve their lives. And some of these folks are set to get out in 6 months, in 3 months, in a couple of weeks, and we've caged them like absolute animals. And just to experience that, even for 2-3 hours at a time or 4 hours at a time, being locked in that prison, it's a traumatic experience. I mean, it really is traumatic. To be in that kind of a situation, just to be hopeless in that sense that I will be here forever or there's no way out. Now, don't get me wrong, there are certain crimes, horrific crimes like rape and murder, that I think people should go away for a long time. Right? I'm not trying to diminish the horror of that. When you have people that have 3 non-violent drug offenses and they're in for 50 years for a 3 strikes rule, or like Crystal Mason, the woman who accidentally voted and got 5 years in prison. These kinds of stories are unfortunately not the exception. There's many like them, and so kind of looking at the criminal justice system as it is and recognizing that it actually isn't broken. It's working exactly as it was intended, to create a racial and economic class system. The 13th Amendment doesn't ban slavery. It simply says that if someone goes to prison, then slavery is legal in prison. This is why firefighters in California who are incarcerated are being paid $5 a day to risk their lives and fight these fires. But then once they're released and they've so-called, paid their debt to society, we say, oh, you have a felony. You can't get gainful employment and earn an actual paycheck. The only way we'll let you fight fires is if you become a slave of the state and earn $5 a day. I mean, it's unconscionable. So I would propose, or I do propose, continue to be allowed to vote as a constitutional right. There's no, unless somebody commits voter fraud, for example, I don't really see the point in taking someone's right to vote away. It just simply doesn't make any sense to me, right? If somebody commits a DUI, we take away their driving privileges for a little while. We don't, take their house away, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? You don't deny someone. We don't take away their First Amendment right because they get a DUI. So the idea that just because you committed a felony, you have your constitutional guarantees taken away, just doesn't make any sense to me. Second, I think it has to happen. We have to abolish private prisons. We absolutely have to get rid of them. It's modern day human trafficking. People are incentivized to keep people in prison rather than to rehabilitate them. And then we need to aggressively end things like cash bail. It just fundamentally needs to stop because, it's become a power trip. It's become a way to incarcerate people without due process of law. Either we are a nation that upholds our constitutional principles or we're not. I think Jon Stewart said it best when he's talking about Guantanamo Bay, that if you only hold on to your values when it's easy, they're not values, they're hobbies. And so either we have values or we have hobbies. And I believe we have to have values. So, experiencing the criminal justice system as a chaplain and just being able to look at my fellow citizens in the eyes and see their struggle and being completely helpless to actually do anything for them is definitely something that I take motivation from, in the sense that we need to change policy to prevent this. And then on the economic side, on the public health side, the lower that we can create rates of recidivism, the better, right? The fewer people that are going back to prison, the better, because now you have more active members of society doing positive and healthy things. So when you have, Sweden, for example, and I get the demographic differences, but on this point, I think it makes sense, has a 40% recidivism rate. We have a 77% recidivism rate. One in 300 Americans are in prison. 1 in 1,200 Swedes are in prison. So, when you look at what they're doing and the way those incarcerated Swedes live, they are allowed things like taking yoga classes. They are allowed to learn cooking and to learn a skill while they're in prison, which makes sense, right? The punishment is that you're cut off from society. The punishment shouldn't be a torture that you're denied basic human dignity. as well. That, if prison is about reform and rehabilitation, then use that time that you're cut off from society to reform and rehabilitate, so that you can re-enter society as a functioning citizen. And the last thing I'll mention, among many others that I'm sure will come to mind later, is we need to end solitary confinement. The Constitution explicitly forbids cruel and unusual punishment, and solitary confinement is absolutely cruel and unusual punishment, and it must stop.
Absolutely. Did you happen to read Bernie Sanders' criminal justice plan?
Yeah, I happen to agree with I think just about, if not all of it.
Yeah, it touched on pretty much all of that. It was all encompassed, pretty incredible. So essentially, and I saw that on your website as well, you believe in more rehabilitation than being imprisoned. Does that also go with opioids? And because I know in Virginia there's a bit of an epidemic. Do you also believe in treatment instead of jail?
Well, I mean, addiction is an illness, not a crime. I think first we need to recognize that. My opponent, unfortunately, believes that it's a crime, and he wants to continue to try to arrest our way out of this. What I've been doing is meeting with the sheriffs of the counties that my district oversees, and even though they're Republican sheriffs, they've agreed with me that yes, we need to try treating this as an illness and provide resources behind medical treatment, not as a crime where we take someone who's high and throw them in prison, let them suffer through the withdrawal symptoms and maybe die, because that just doesn't work. It's cruel, it's inhumane, and most importantly, it's ineffective, and costs much more money than it would otherwise if we just provided them treatment. So the sheriffs here, we talked about this. They are starting programs where you can turn in narcotics, no questions asked. If you voluntarily bring them in, you will not be arrested. You won't be charged. You can turn them in, no questions asked, and you can walk away just fine. Which I think is fantastic. That's great.
That's awesome.
That's community engagement. It's not policing; it's community engagement. It's service to the community, and that's how you build trust. So, again, my frustration is my opponent is pretty draconian in his views. He had the audacity to say that he's never seen a drug crisis like this before. Apparently, he never saw the crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s. It didn't matter to him back then, and now suddenly, because it's affecting his inner circle personally, now it's suddenly an issue, which I just think it's the epitome of privilege and callousness. So, we're focused on treating this as an illness, and when people are ill, you don't punish them, you rehabilitate them, you give them treatment, you give them medicine. And I think that's not only going to be a faster way to help our society recover from this, but it's also, again, an economically smart way as well, because you're not wasting taxpayer dollars locking people up who are sick. You're investing taxpayer money on rehabilitating people who need rehabilitation and helping them become functioning members of society once again.
Right on. So, let me see. You also have on your platform, kind of going into this, Medicaid expansion. So that isn't supported in all states, but Virginia is one of them. So is that something that you think you should expand more on, or is your concern more that you fear it's being taken away?
Well, so it was finally after Democrats put enough pressure on Republicans that a couple of Republicans switched the party line and voted in favor of Medicaid expansion in Virginia. And now, last I checked, 312,000 new Virginians have access to health care when they had nothing before. And when you look at the studies of states that have voted to accept Medicaid expansion versus those that haven't, those that accepted Medicaid expansion have a lower mortality rate, a lower maternal fatality rate, a lower infant fatality rate. I mean, you can see the numbers, demonstrable. I was with Terry McAuliffe, the former governor of Virginia, the previous governor of Virginia, And he talked about his biggest regret is that he wasn't able to get Medicaid expanded. And what keeps him up at night is recognizing that Virginians died simply because some GOP leaders were so arrogant and self-serving that they refused to vote to allow lower income, destitute Virginians to have access to healthcare, cancer treatment, mental health treatment, drug addiction rehabilitation. I mean, a kid with a broken leg or a guy with a broken leg. I mean, fundamental basic human rights were denied because these people were too arrogant to vote yes on healthcare expansion. Now what Republicans are trying to do is enforce a work requirement. You have to report certain work hours. And I mean, they're so focused on finding fraud where none exists or an insignificant amount exists among poor people that they completely ignore the fraud by billionaire corporations that have plunged our economy into recession over and over and over again. So like Dr. King talks about, America is a country that has socialism for the wealthy, but rugged individualism for the poor. And that's kind of what we're seeing. So we need to ensure we put more Democrats into these seats for next session. One, to prevent this ridiculously foolish work requirement that will kick people off healthcare. And two, to find ways to raise the threshold to qualify for Medicaid, because right now it's still too low. And just because you're earning $40,000 or $50,000 a year does not mean you can afford health insurance. In fact, the ALICE report done by the United Way for the region that I'm in, Stafford and Fredericksburg, shows that for a family of four to live in not even a comfortable, but in a very basic conservative 2-bedroom apartment and pay for things like a car and gas and grocery bills and daycare, they need to earn $82,000 a year. And think about that. That's not living extravagantly. It's just having a cell phone, having a car note, paying rent, buying groceries. No gym membership, no vacations, no fancy Lexus. We're talking a basic car, and these are folks who may still be working at an hourly wage job that doesn't provide healthcare. And so people think $82,000, well, that's a ton of money. They should be able to afford it. Well, the reality is that they still can't because healthcare costs money. And so what I would like to do is find ways to expand it to include more people and take some of the money that we're wasting on things that are irrelevant, like a border wall or tax cuts for billionaires and trillionaire corporations, and instead invest it in ensuring that healthcare is a protected human right for all citizens.
Now, I noticed on your platform, and right now, you didn't say the words Medicare for all or universal health care.
Yeah.
What is your stance on that?
Well, because I'm fighting for a state seat, Medicare for all is really more of a federal program that needs to come down. Right. I believe healthcare is a human right, so I absolutely will not be voting for a candidate who does not believe in universal healthcare. So like the plan that someone like Senator Sanders has put forward, I fully support, because I believe healthcare is a fundamental human right. The reason why I haven't talked about that on a state level campaign is because on a state level campaign, that isn't really the way things are done. There's different methods. I think Massachusetts has a pretty good model. I think they have like 97, 98% coverage, which isn't 100%, but it's definitely better than 85%. So I want to be realistic with my constituents on what we can promise. And right now, what I know we can promise is to protect Medicaid, ensure the work requirement doesn't get implemented, expand Medicaid, and then find ways to look at the gaps and see what policies we can implement. I mean, one of the things I'd love to explore more, and Bernie Sanders has talked about this extensively, is separating healthcare from employment. It doesn't make any sense to have those two connected. It's an extra burden, especially if you're a small business. It's an extra unnecessary burden on a small business. So we need to find a way to pool together people to drive down the cost and allow them to have healthcare that they can keep regardless of what job they have or don't have.
Absolutely. Have you officially endorsed a 2020 candidate yet?
I've not, but I'll tell you my top four choices are Sanders, Warren, actually top three are Sanders, Warren, and Castro.
I can handle that, but my top three are Bernie, Bernie, Bernie. Yeah. That's just me. Yeah. But you're getting a lot of props in the comments, which is awesome.
Well, you got good people that follow you. That's why.
What's that?
I said it's because you have good people that follow you. That's why.
I do. Oh my God, I don't know what I would do without these viewers. They are incredible. You also on your platform, you do have the Fight for 15, which we discussed. And that's what I made a note of. Your 39th in infrastructure.
Yeah.
So what, I know you touched on infrastructure a little bit, but what are some of the things, let's say the Green New Deal passes, we have the federal job guarantee. What are we doing first in your district?
Well, what's happened in my district is that we're the third worst traffic disaster in America. It's ridiculous. I mean, 15 years ago, from my house to DC in traffic was about a 45-minute drive. Now it can be about 2.5 hours in traffic. That's how bad it's gotten. And you have had a Republican-controlled legislature this entire time who takes massive amounts of money from developers who are heavily focused on just building, without any regard for the impact it has on roads, on the breakdown of roads and bridges, on the need for more schools, more pharmacies. It takes me, it's a 25-minute drive for me to get to the nearest mall from here. It's a 15-minute drive to get to the nearest pharmacy from here. And it's not because I live in a remote area. I mean, we live in a pretty populated area, but they've been so focused on building houses that they forgot that people need gas stations, people need pharmacies, people need grocery stores, people, want movie theaters. And when you don't have those things, you can't really expect businesses to move in here either. And so what they've done is a double whammy. They've built a massive amount of homes. The population is skyrocketing in this area. They've built nothing to attract businesses. And so half of the problem is that, the majority of people that live in this region work all the way up in DC. So that's unnecessary traffic on the road. We could solve half of our traffic issues if we simply had better business models for corporations and for companies to settle in Central Virginia so people aren't driving 50 miles one way to get to work. They're driving 10 or 15 miles to work locally. That's one thing. Second thing is, in all that infrastructure bill, in all that housing bill, they also neglected not just roads, but also internet and broadband. And so you have some rural areas of our district that in 2019 have dial-up or have such slow satellite that it's just prohibitively expensive. Well, not only does that harm homes, but if you're a business and you want to set up shop and you can't get internet, you're not setting up shop, right? And so it's stifling progress in that respect. And then finally, we're not exploring ways to make money off of an internet sales tax. We're not exploring ways to make money off of taxing millionaires and billionaires more. We're taxing middle income and lower income people, which is nonsense. I mean, in addition to like sales tax and property tax and things like that, people living below the poverty line pay 5% state tax, 5%. And the way the Virginia tax code is set up is that if you make $1 million, your tax rate is 5.75%. So the difference between somebody making $17,000 a year and $1 million a year is just 0.75%. And so it's a backwards model. It's a broken model. I would like to find a way to lower taxes on middle class and lower income earning people and raise them 2 to 3% on people making over $500,000 or $1 million a year, and use that revenue to then start to invest in local businesses, start to invest in telecommuting, start to invest in building out infrastructure that can incentivize businesses to move here in the first place. Right now, the fact that we are the 9th wealthiest state, but right around 40th in infrastructure, shows that it's not a money issue, it's a prioritization issue. And that's where the policymakers we have right now have just done such a terrible job. It's long overdue that we shift them out and put progressives in the mix who recognize the long view and make the necessary decisions to protect the long view for our Commonwealth and for our country.
Right, absolutely. So what is something you would like to, oh wait, before we end, I gotta ask you a question.
Yeah.
You put in your description, in your bio on Twitter, that you are a dad joke maven.
I am.
And I just kind of feel like you should have something if you want to represent. So,
well, I've got a lot of favorites. My favorite one is I found out that there is a species of dog that gets sad if you feed it a cantaloupe. It's called a melancholy. Huh? There we go. For me, it's cathartic for me because I troll my wife with these comments, and I'll come to her very seriously and say, hey, my foot keeps falling asleep. There's actually a medical condition. She's like, oh, what's it called? I'm like, it's called comatose. And then she'll roll her eyes at me and question why she married me in the first place. But
That's awesome.
Laugh at yourself and have a sense of humor about things.
Tell your kids this one if they don't already know it. How do you make a handkerchief dance?
You put a little boogie in it?
Oh, darn. That's always been my favorite.
Yeah, that's a good one. There's a lot of good ones. There's a lot. It's great. There's no such thing as a bad dad joke.
Well, why don't you give these guys something to leave them with that they can take away from this interview, and also give them, your website, your Twitter, all that fun stuff, so they can recommend you to anyone in Virginia.
Well, look, I appreciate Joy. I appreciate you. I appreciate this platform. I appreciate what you're doing in having these conversations. And I'm grateful to have a few minutes on your platform. It means a lot to me. And my message to your viewers is simply this. We are in a race that is historic in proportions. I'm the first American Muslim candidate to win a Virginia Senate nomination in our 400-year history. And if and when elected, I'll be the first American Muslim to win a Virginia Senate seat in our nation's history, in our Commonwealth's history. My opponent is someone who is 98% funded by corporations. He praises Robert E. Lee as a great American hero. He's voted against the ERA, voted against bans on discrimination against women and the LGBTQ community in workplace and housing. He's voted against Medicaid expansion, voted against a minimum wage increase, voted against every single common sense gun reform, including something as simple as background checks. I mean, he is the antithesis of progress. And he's also launched in a virulent anti-Muslim campaign against me, demonizing my faith and trying to tie me to terrorism, notwithstanding the fact that I've written several books against terrorism. So my ask of each of you out there is, it's not money, it's time. What we need are volunteers. Ours is a people-powered campaign. We don't accept money from corporations or from lobbyists or developers. We have, I'm very proud of this, we have more individual donors than any candidate in Virginia, by far. No one even comes close. That's Republican or Democrat. We're running a really powerful grassroots campaign. In fact, I had a debate with my opponent a couple of days ago. It's on YouTube, you can watch it. And in my closing statement, I pointed out that my campaign got more individual donors in the last 2 days of August than his campaign has received in the last 4 years combined. Because that's how we roll. His was 394 donations in the last 4 years. We had 395 in the last 2 days. And that's how we'll continue to fight. So whether you're in Virginia or not, we have a ton of things you can be doing. You can be making phone calls for us. writing postcards for us, sending text messages for us. Maybe you have a superhero power that we don't know about. Maybe you can like train pigeons to send messages. I don't know. Whatever it is, get in touch with us. My website is my name, QasimRashid.com. I'm on Twitter at Qasim Rashid. Send me a DM. My email is qasim@rashidforva.com. I'm very easy to get a hold of. But we would love for you to be involved and help us flip the seat and bring about these desperately needed reforms. I'm not running for office out of aspiration. I'm running out of frustration, out of anger, and I'm channeling my rage into service to humanity. This is why I'm here, and this is why I'm asking you to invest in us and support us. And I believe that if we can build this coalition of volunteers, then we will win this, and we will be able to bring about those desperately needed changes. And one last thing I forgot to mention during our conversation, but I'm also very pro-union. In fact, I'm trying to coin a new phrase that I hope picks up. I call corporate intrusion. I don't call it right to work, because I think that's a terrible term that puts us on the defensive. It's corporations intruding into our rights as workers. And we need to end corporate intrusion, and we need to strengthen unions and return equity and fairness to the working class. So if these are things you believe in, then join our campaign, volunteer for us, even if it's just an hour a week. If we get 100 people doing that, that's 2.5 people working for our campaign. We pay our team, our associates, at least $15 an hour or more. And we actually have an all-women team as well. It just happened to work out that way. Awesome. My campaign manager is an African-American woman. My finance director is a Palestinian woman. My field director is a white woman. And our 2 interns is a Chinese ancestor. She's American, but her ancestry is Chinese. And the other one, she's American, but her ancestry is Indian. And so we're super excited to have a robust team that reflects our values. And I would love to have you guys join our team as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a great discussion. I wish you the best of luck with your race coming up and your campaign. Thank you guys for watching as well. You're always amazing. So thank you again. Take care. Best of luck.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.